Why can't you change?
Yeah.
Even when you really, truly want to. It's a question we've all wrestled with, I think.
It might honestly be the single most frustrating question we ever ask ourselves.
Yeah.
I mean, it sits right at the core of so much human suffering.
We all know the exact feeling. You are lying in bed at night, the house is completely quiet, you're
Yeah.
just staring up at the ceiling, and you make this solemn promise to yourself. You say, tomorrow is the day.
Tomorrow, everything shifts.
Exactly. You tell yourself, I'm going to stop engaging in that behavior I hate. I'm going to finally become the person I know I can be. And in that specific, quiet moment, the motivation, it doesn't just feel like a thought.
No, it feels real.
It feels like a literal physical force expanding inside your chest.
You feel absolute, undeniable certainty. Because in the stillness of that night, the friction of the real world just doesn't exist yet.
Right. There's no stress yet.
Exactly. So your brain effortlessly maps out this idealized version of your future. It feels so easy.
But then, of course, tomorrow actually arrives. Your alarm goes off.
The real world hits.
Yeah, the world starts demanding things from you. And, maybe you do well for a day. Maybe you just white-knuckle your way through a full week of this new behavior.
You feel that initial surge of adrenaline carrying you forward.
Yeah, but inevitably the exhaustion sets in. The motivation you felt in bed it evaporates. It doesn't even leave with a bang.
It just quietly slips out the back door.
Right. And before you can even consciously process what is happening, you have collapsed right back into the exact same patterns you swore to yourself you were leaving behind forever.
And following that collapse is a very specific, profound sense of shame.
It really is.
It's a feeling of isolation, where you start quietly cataloging all your flaws.
That shame is so heavy. You start internalizing the failure, thinking, what is structurally wrong with me? Why is my willpower so incredibly weak when other people seem to manage their lives just fine?
It's a very lonely place to be.
It is. So we are going to deconstruct all of that today. We're taking a deep dive into the science of habit, the neurobiology of identity, and really the architecture of the human brain.
It's a fascinating area of research.
And the very first thing we want to say to you, listening to this right now, especially if you are currently stuck in that exhausting, demoralizing cycle of trying to change, failing, and feeling profound disappointment in yourself, is this.
Yeah, this is so important.
Your struggles are entirely valid. The sheer frustration you feel is completely real. But we need to reframe the entire premise.
I really do.
What if the problem isn't a lack of willpower at all?
That reframe changes everything, honestly. We have been culturally conditioned to believe that personal change is simply a matter of character.
Right, like it's a moral feeling if you can't do it.
Exactly. We think it's about gritting our teeth and white-knuckling our way through temptation. But when we actually look at the foundational research bridging neurobiology, evolutionary psychology, and behavioral science, we see a landscape that contradicts almost everything we've been taught.
It's kind of mind-blowing once you dig into the sources.
It really is. Losing trust in yourself because you keep failing to change, well, it isn't a sign of weakness. It is a completely natural, predictable byproduct of the flawed cycle you find yourself trapped in.
So our overarching mission for this deep dive is to prove to you that you are not broken.
You are absolutely not broken.
You are simply attempting to force change in ways that violently violate the fundamental biological and psychological laws of human behavior.
Yeah, you're fighting biology.
So let's start by looking at that incredibly familiar feeling of your willpower just running dry by the end of the day. Because in the psychological literature we reviewed, there's this fascinating concept called ego depletion.
Ego depletion, yes.
And it stems from some deeply influential studies in the late 1990s, particularly the famous radish and chocolate chip cookie experiment by Roy Baumeister.
Oh, that experiment is a perfect starting point.
Yeah.
Because it beautifully illustrates the actual friction of self-control.
Walk us through it.
So Baumeister and his team brought hungry participants into a lab, and they filled the room with the overwhelming delicious scent of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies.
Okay, so they're already hungry, and now it smells like warm cookies.
Exactly. Then they split the people into two groups. Group A was allowed to just eat the warm cookies.
Lucky group.
Very lucky. But Group B, they were told they could not touch the cookies at all. Instead, they were given a bowl of raw radishes to eat.
Just the ultimate cruel psychological test.
Utterly cruel, right. So the researchers then took both groups and gave them a completely impossible geometry puzzle to solve.
Wait, it's actually impossible?
Yes, there was no solution. They just wanted to measure persistence. How long would these people try before giving up?
Oh, I see.
And the people who got to eat the cookies, the ones who didn't have to exert any willpower, they worked on the impossible puzzle for an average of 19 minutes before throwing in the towel.
19 minutes is a decent amount of time for an impossible puzzle.
It is. But the people who had to eat the radishes, the ones who had to actively suppress their intense desire for the cookies, they gave up after only 8 minutes.
Wow. Less than half the time.
Right, because they had already spent their cognitive capital.
They were depleted.
Exactly. Baumeister proposed that willpower is basically a finite resource, like a muscle that gets fatigued, or a car with a limited tank of gas.
Now, I know the modern scientific community has vigorously debated this model recently.
They have, yes.
Like, some massive meta-analyses suggest the gas tank metaphor is maybe too simplistic, and researchers like Michael Inslicht argue it's less about a literal depletion of brain energy and more about a shift in the brain's motivational priorities.
Right. The brain simply gets tired of have-to tasks and aggressively shifts its focus to want-to tasks.
But regardless of the underlying cellular mechanism, the sensation of ego depletion is undeniably real.
Well, the subjective experience is absolute. The demands of your daily life act as a continuous cognitive tax.
Like every single little thing you do.
Every micro decision you make. Every time you suppress your frustration when a colleague sends an annoying email. Every moment you force yourself to focus on a spreadsheet instead of checking your phone. It all accumulates.
So by the time 8 p.m. rolls around...
By 8 p.m., the prefrontal areas of your brain responsible for executive control are just screaming for relief. You have nothing left in the tank to fight off an old, comforting habit.
The way I've always visualized this reliance on pure willpower, it's like trying to hold a fully inflated beach ball underwater.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
You can definitely do it for a little while, right? You lock your elbows, you use your shoulder strength, you push it down beneath the surface of the pool, and from the outside it looks completely peaceful.
You look totally in control.
Exactly. It looks like you've conquered the situation. But the physics of the water are constantly, relentlessly pushing back against your hands.
It requires continuous, active tension.
And eventually, your arms are going to tremble. Your focus is going to slip for just a microsecond. And the second you let up, that beach ball violently breaches the surface, launching into the air and splashing you in the face.
That captures the mechanics perfectly because the water in that scenario, that constant, relentless upward pressure that never sleeps and never tires, that represents your brain's automated programming.
That's biology.
That is your biology executing exactly what it was designed to execute over millions of years of evolution. And recognizing that pressure brings us to the hidden truth that really serves as the foundation for everything we need to unpack today.
Which is what exactly?
The truth is, you absolutely possess the physical capacity to change. Your brain is built for it. But you are likely trying to change by fighting the water, rather than redirecting it.
I want to push on that idea of possessing the physical capacity to change, because when you are in the depths of a bad habit, it doesn't feel like a choice.
No, it feels permanent.
It feels like those neural pathways are literally set in concrete inside your skull. So if I actually can change, how does that work on a literal physiological level?
Well, to understand that, we have to explore one of the most profound paradigm shifts in the history of neuroscience. And that is the discovery of neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity.
Yes. This is the brain's physical, structural ability to continuously reorganize itself, to break old neural connections and forge new ones in response to learning, experience, or even injury.
Which is amazing.
It's incredible. And the deeply fascinating context here is that for the vast majority of modern scientific history, neurologists got this entirely wrong.
Right. The prevailing dogma for decades was the concept of the hardwired brain.
That was the absolute consensus.
Like once you hit your mid-20s, the concrete was poured and set.
Up until the late 1960s and 70s, the scientific establishment fiercely defended the idea that the adult brain was a static machine. They believed you had a critical developmental window in childhood, and after that, your neural architecture was fixed.
So if you lost a capability, or if a habit was ingrained by adulthood, it was just permanent.
Exactly. But a few pioneering visionaries began to observe anomalies that challenged this dogma.
The sources mention Santiago Ramon y Cajal, going all the way back to the early 20th century.
Cajal is widely considered the father of modern neuroscience. He spent his life painstakingly staining brain tissue and staring through primitive microscopes.
Just endlessly looking at cells.
Yeah, and he was the first to propose the neuron doctrine. The idea that the brain isn't a single continuous web, but billions of individual cells separated by microscopic gaps called synapses.
And even back then, he suspected they could change.
He did. He hypothesized that the strength of the connections across these gaps could change based on mental exercise. He hinted at the regenerative capacity of the nervous system.
But I'm guessing people didn't listen.
The technology didn't exist to prove it, so his ideas about plasticity were largely ignored for a long time.
It wasn't until researchers like Michael Merzenich came along decades later that the establishment had to finally concede.
Mersenich's experiments were just groundbreaking.
They mapped the brains of owl monkeys, right? Specifically looking at the somatosensory cortex, the area that processes touch.
Yes, and Mersenich's work systematically dismantled the hardwired theory. He mapped exactly which tiny cluster of neurons in the monkey's brain lit up when a specific finger was touched.
Okay, so a very precise map.
Very precise.
Yeah.
Then, in a pivotal experiment, he sutured two of the monkey's fingers together so they moved as a single unit.
They literally sewed the fingers together.
They did, and after a few months, he mapped the brain again.
And what happened?
The brain map hadn't just stayed the same, it had completely reorganized. The distinct neural borders between those two fingers had dissolved, merging into a single new map.
Wow.
The brain literally redrew its own physical anatomy to adapt to the new sensory reality.
That is wild. And then you read the clinical case studies documented by Norman Doidge in his book, The Brain That Changes Itself, and it stops being about monkeys and starts being profoundly human.
Doidge's work is incredibly moving.
He documents people recovering from massive, catastrophic brain damage. We are talking about stroke victims whose brains were essentially dead in the regions responsible for movement.
Completely paralyzed on one side of their body.
Yet, through rigorous, constrained therapy, other completely different parts of their brain took over the function of the dead tissue.
It's like a detour on a highway.
Exactly. The brain physically rewired its own routing board to allow them to walk and pick up a cup of coffee again. It proves unequivocally that the human brain is highly plastic from cradle to grave.
It is a dynamic, living ecosystem that is continuously molding itself to whatever you do most frequently.
And there's a mechanism for that, right?
Yes. It's often summarized by the famous Hebbian principle, neurons that fire together, wire together.
Neurons that fire together, wire together.
Right. Every time you learn a new chord on a guitar, every time you practice a new language, or even every time you consciously choose a new way of interpreting a stressful event, you are causing specific neurons to fire in sequence.
And the more you do it,
do it enough, and the brain physically thickens the myelin sheath around those neural pathways, making the transmission of that specific signal faster and more efficient. You're structurally altering your own mind.
Okay, so I understand the mechanism, but this is where I have to pause and challenge this beautiful narrative of neuroplasticity.
Please do.
Because if my brain is this miraculous, infinitely adaptable organ designed to heal itself and form new pathways, well, why do I feel so helplessly stuck?
That is the big question.
If plasticity is real, why is it so agonizingly difficult to just stop binge eating or stop doom scrolling at 2 a.m.? Why does the beach ball always pop back up with such violence?
That tension you were pointing out, that is the crux of the entire human struggle. And the answer is that neuroplasticity is completely neutral.
Neutral.
It doesn't have a moral compass. It doesn't care about your health, your happiness, or your long-term goals. It simply reinforces whatever you do repeatedly.
So bad habits get reinforced just like good ones.
Your bad habits are just as much a product of neuroplasticity as your good ones. In fact, your bad habits have carved massive, highly efficient neural superhighways in your brain.
Oof, that makes sense.
To understand why fighting those highways feels impossible, we have to look at the structural anatomy of the brain. We need to distinguish between two deeply different regions, the cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia.
The cerebral cortex, that is the wrinkly outer layer we always see in pictures of the brain, right? The thinking cap.
Precisely. The prefrontal cortex, specifically, is where your conscious identity lives. It is the seat of logic, complex planning, abstract reasoning, and your good intentions.
So when I'm lying in bed, making promises.
When you are lying in bed at night, vividly imagining a healthier, more productive version of yourself, that is your prefrontal cortex doing the heavy lifting. It's incredibly sophisticated, but it has a massive vulnerability.
Which is?
It is a huge energy hog. It tires very, very quickly.
Which brings us back to ego depletion. The prefrontal cortex is the muscle holding the beach ball.
Exactly. Now, compare that to the basal ganglia. This is a much older, more primitive cluster of structures sitting deep within the center of the brain.
Okay, so it's deep inside.
Yes, it includes areas like the striatum. And the primary evolutionary mandate of the basal ganglia is pattern recognition and automation.
Automation, so it runs on autopilot.
It is the ultimate efficiency engine. When you repeat an action enough times in a specific context, the basal ganglia takes over. It bundles that sequence of actions into a single neurological package, a process called chunking, so that your prefrontal cortex doesn't have to think about it anymore.
It's nature's way of saving cognitive battery life.
It's vital for our survival, honestly. Think about learning to drive a car.
Oh yeah, at first it's terrifying.
At first, your prefrontal cortex is fully engaged. You are intensely focused on the steering wheel, the pedals, the mirrors, the spatial awareness. It is exhausting. You can't even hold conversation.
But after 5 years of driving...
After 5 years, the basal ganglia has chunked the behavior. You can drive all the way to work, navigate traffic, change lanes, and arrive at your office without having a single conscious memory of the commute.
You are just lost in thought.
You were lost in thought while the basal ganglia drove the car.
And the sources we analyzed highlight a statistic that is honestly terrifying when you first read it. Up to 65% of our daily decisions are made on complete autopilot.
More than half of your day.
That's staggering.
Over half of the words you speak, the things you eat, the postures you assume, and the emotional reactions you have, they are not conscious choices. They are recorded scripts executing automatically from the basal ganglia.
So when we use willpower to try and break a habit, we are initiating a fundamentally unfair biological war.
Very unfair.
We are pitting our easily exhausted, high-energy prefrontal cortex against the basal ganglia, which just runs on endless, effortless automation.
The basal ganglia doesn't care that you want to lose weight. It only cares about running the script it has optimized over the last 10 years.
That is the exact friction. You're asking a sprinter to compete against a freight train.
To understand how to actually manage this, we need to dissect how the basal ganglia scripts actually trigger. And this brings us to the architecture of the habit loop.
Now, anyone who has read Charles Duhigg or James Clear is familiar with the basic three-part structure, right? Cue, routine, and reward.
Yes. But we need to go deeper into the neurobiology of this loop, because the cue isn't just a gentle reminder, it is a neurological tripwire.
A tripwire? How so?
The cue is the catalyst. It can be anything. The ping of a specific notification on your phone, the smell of a certain food, walking into a specific room, or even a sudden spike in cortisol from stress.
And what happens when that tripwire is hit?
When that environmental or emotional cue registers, it bypasses the prefrontal cortex entirely.
It doesn't even ask permission.
Not at all. It communicates directly with the amygdala, which processes the emotional weight of the cue, and the hippocampus, which instantly retrieves the contextual memory of what you usually do in this situation.
And this is where the neurochemical magic or nightmare happens. This is where dopamine enters the equation.
Dopamine is perhaps the most misunderstood neurotransmitter in popular culture.
People always think it's just the pleasure chemical, right?
Exactly. People describe dopamine as the feeling of reward you get when you eat a piece of cake. But the work of neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz fundamentally changed our understanding of this.
What did Schultz find?
Well, dopamine is not about the reward itself. It is about the anticipation of the reward. It is a learning and motivation signal.
Right. Schultz measured the brains of monkeys who were trained to pull a lever to get juice when a light came on.
Yes. And initially, the dopamine spikes when the juice actually hit their tongues.
Because they got the reward.
Right. But as the basal ganglia learned the habit loop, the dopamine spike shifted. It stopped spiking when they got the juice and started spiking the moment the light came on.
The cue itself triggered the dopamine release.
That dopamine spike acts as an intense, localized motivational drive. It narrows your visual and cognitive focus exclusively onto acquiring the reward.
It creates a craving.
A feeling of craving so intense that it feels like an itch you simply have to scratch. So your cue happens, say, you feel a wave of anxiety after a difficult meeting.
Oh, yeah.
Your hippocampus remembers that a glass of wine soothes that anxiety. Your brain floods with dopamine in anticipation. The craving becomes overwhelming.
And that leads to the routine. Pouring the wine, lighting the cigarette, opening the social media app.
And finally, the reward. The immediate temporary relief or pleasure.
And that reward provides a feedback signal to the brain, cementing the loop. It tells the basal ganglia, yes, that solved the problem. The next time we feel anxious, remember this exact sequence.
The synaptic connections thicken. The habit becomes slightly more permanent.
What's terrifying is how tightly these loops are bound to our physical environment. The cues are just woven into the spaces we inhabit.
They absolutely are.
It perfectly explains a phenomenon I think every listener has experienced. Why we so rapidly and helplessly revert to old, discarded versions of ourselves when we visit familiar environments.
Environmental reversion is incredibly common. You can spend a decade moving away, going to therapy, building a mature, disciplined lifestyle.
You feel like a totally new person.
You do. And yet the moment you walk through the front door of your childhood home for the holidays or sit down at a bar with your high school friends, within 10 minutes you are behaving exactly like you did at 17 years old.
You lose your temper at your parents in the exact same way. You engage in the same old vices.
It's like your new identity just vaporizes.
Why does the environment hold that much power over the prefrontal cortex?
Because the environmental cues in that childhood home are the deepest, most heavily insulated neural pathways in your basal ganglia. They were formed during your most critical developmental years.
That makes sense.
But there is also a deeper evolutionary mechanism at play here related to social belonging. Psychologists call it social baseline theory.
How does that connect to falling back into bad habits?
Humans are profoundly social mammals. For our ancient ancestors, being accepted by the tribe wasn't just a nice feeling. It was a literal matter of survival.
Because if you were alone, you'd die.
If you were ostracized from the group, you would starve or be killed by predators.
Yeah.
Therefore, our brains evolved a deep biological alarm system regarding social cohesion.
Okay, so bringing that back to modern times.
Right. If you have grown and changed significantly, but you return to a group of old friends who expect you to be the old friend, you asserting your new, healthier identity creates social friction.
It makes things awkward.
It creates a subtle threat to the group dynamic, and your brain, operating on ancient survival software, perceives that social friction as a literal threat to your life.
So to avoid the risk of being cast out, we unconsciously adapt. We morph back into the puzzle piece that fits the old group.
Exactly. We fall back on the trusted, automated behaviors that we know are accepted in that specific context. We play the part, even if it violently contradicts the person we are actively trying to become.
That is deeply relatable. But it brings up a crucial question about the internal experience of this failure.
What do you mean?
Well, because when we do this, when we revert to the old habit or break the promise we made to ourselves in bed the night before, it doesn't feel good.
No, it feels awful.
It feels terrible. What exactly is happening in our minds when our conscious desire to change collides with our automatic basal ganglia-driven behavior?
That collision generates one of the most powerful psychological forces in human experience. It creates a state of intense, agonizing internal friction.
And there's a term for this, right?
Yes. In the mid-1950s, the brilliant social psychologist Leon Festinger coined a term for this: cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance. We hear the term casually thrown around a lot in modern discourse, usually regarding politics, but the actual psychological mechanics of it are fascinating.
Festinger defined cognitive dissonance as the extreme mental discomfort that occurs when a person holds two or more conflicting cognitions.
And a cognition can be what?
A cognition can be a belief, a value, an ideal, or a behavior. The human brain craves internal consistency above almost all else.
So it hates contradiction.
It hates it. If you deeply hold the belief, I am a person who respects my body and wants to be healthy, but your automated behavior leads you to eat an entire box of cookies, those two cognitions cannot logically exist in the same space. They are at war.
And the research shows this isn't just an abstract intellectual problem. It registers as actual pain.
It does. Neuroimaging studies have shown that experiencing cognitive dissonance activates areas like the anterior insular and the anterior cingulate cortex,
which are regions involved in processing pain.
Regions heavily involved in processing psychological pain and emotional distress. Festinger theorized that the greater the magnitude of this dissonance, the more desperate the brain becomes to alleviate it.
Like trying to quench a thirst.
The drive to reduce cognitive dissonance is as fundamental and urgent as the drive to satisfy physical hunger or thirst.
To truly grasp the power of cognitive dissonance, we should look at Festinger's most famous study, because he didn't just study this in a sterile lab. He actually infiltrated a doomsday cult.
Yes, documented in his classic 1956 book, When Prophecy Fails.
Tell us about that.
Festinger and his colleagues infiltrated a cult led by a woman named Dorothy Martin. She had convinced her followers that a massive flood was going to destroy the world on December 21st.
But there was a catch.
But a flying saucer was coming to rescue the true believers.
And these followers, they gave up everything.
Everything. They quit their jobs, gave away their money, cut ties with their families. They were entirely committed.
And then December 21st arrives. They are all sitting in the living room, waiting. Midnight passes. No flood. No flying saucer.
The prophecy completely fails.
Now, a rational outside observer would assume that the followers would realize they had been tricked, accept they were wrong, and abandon the cult.
But Festinger predicted the exact opposite, based on cognitive dissonance, because the followers had sacrificed so much. The dissonance between their massive behavioral commitment and the reality that they were wrong would be psychologically unbearable. The pain would break them.
So how did they resolve the pain without admitting they were wrong?
The cult leader emerged and claimed that she had received a new message. She said that because of the group's unwavering faith and the light they had generated that night, the aliens had decided to spare the Earth.
Wow.
The world was saved because of them.
And the followers believed it. In fact, they became even more zealous. They started calling the press and recruiting new members.
Exactly. They couldn't change the past behavior. They had already quit their jobs and given away their money. To resolve the unbearable dissonance, they had to twist their perception of reality. They changed their attitude to justify the behavior.
And while that's an extreme example, we do the exact same thing on a micro level every time we fail to change a habit.
We absolutely do.
When we experience that painful gap between our goals and our actions, the logical solution would be to do the hard work of changing the behavior. But changing the behavior requires fighting the basal ganglia,
Which requires immense prefrontal cortex energy.
So the human brain, seeking the path of least resistance, acts like an immune system for the ego.
Instead of changing the behavior, it deploys defense mechanisms to change the attitude. It rationalizes the failure.
Let's break down the specific rationalization strategies identified in the research, because recognizing them is crucial. The first one is trivialization.
Trivialization is a way of minimizing the importance of the failure to reduce the sting.
Like making it seem small.
You tell yourself, well, one day off my diet won't kill me, or it's just one cigarette. I'll start fresh on Monday. You convince yourself that the conflicting behavior doesn't carry enough weight to matter.
Another strategy is the denial of responsibility.
This is when you externalize the blame. You place the locus of control outside yourself to protect your identity.
I wouldn't have snapped at my kids if my boss hadn't been so unreasonable today.
Or, I had to drink. It was a social obligation, and I didn't want to make things awkward. By claiming you had no choice, you remove the dissonance.
Then there is adding what researchers call consonant cognitions. This is like a mathematical balancing act in the mind.
You try to offset the negative behavior with a positive justification.
Right. Yes, I skipped the gym and watched 4 hours of television, but I walked up the stairs at the office today instead of taking the elevator, so it evens out.
You drown out the dissonance with a chorus of minor justifications.
But the most destructive strategy, the one that truly dismantles our capacity for long-term growth, is what the literature refers to as act rationalization.
Act rationalization.
This goes beyond making an excuse. This is altering your core values.
Act rationalization is the final surrender. When the pain of repeatedly failing to change becomes too heavy, your brain protects you by dismantling the goal itself.
You just give up on wanting it.
You say, you know what? Diet culture is a toxic scam anyway. Being physically fit isn't actually that important to a meaningful life. Or, I'm just fundamentally an anxious person. I'm hardwired this way. Therapy won't work for me.
You abandon the aspiration entirely just to stop the bleeding.
Yeah.
You declare the destination undesirable because you couldn't figure out how to drive the car.
And if we step back and look at this sequence, we uncover the tragic cycle that systematically destroys self-trust.
It flows in a distinct, devastating loop. First, we fail to change because we rely on a quickly depleted prefrontal cortex against the relentless automated triggers of the basal ganglia.
Right.
Second, this behavioral failure triggers the profound psychological pain of cognitive dissonance.
The pain hits.
Third, to urgently soothe that pain, our ego deploys rationalization strategies, ultimately leading us to lower our standards and abandon our goals.
And we repeat the cycle over and over until we cement a fixed belief that we are fundamentally incapable of change.
It is a really dark loop, but understanding the mechanics of it is the first step out. I want to ground all of this heavy theory into a visceral, real-world narrative. Let's create a composite story based on the clinical literature to see how all these invisible forces actually collide in a person's life.
Let's do it. Let's look at a character we'll call David.
Let's follow David's journey. So David is 35 years old, and he has been battling a destructive habit for over a decade. Let's say it's chronic binge drinking.
Okay. A very common struggle.
It has damaged his relationships, his health, his career. One morning, after a particularly bad night, he looks in the mirror and hits his absolute breaking point.
He experiences that profound surge of motivation we talked about earlier.
He vows, "Never again, I am done."
Yeah.
And for the first 3 weeks, David is a machine. He is succeeding entirely on the sheer brute force of willpower. He empties his apartment of all alcohol. He avoids his usual bars.
He's holding the beach ball underwater.
He is, and he feels a fragile but genuine sense of pride.
In those first 3 weeks, his prefrontal cortex is successfully maintaining executive control. But it's vital to note why he is succeeding. His environment is highly controlled and static. The cues have been minimized.
Exactly. But then, a holiday weekend arrives. David has to fly back to his hometown to stay with his family.
Oh boy.
And he's going to be seeing the old friends he grew up with. The very same friends who were the central figures in his heaviest drinking days.
From a neurological perspective, David is willingly walking into a minefield of deeply entrenched environmental triggers.
The moment David's plane touches down, the invisible pressure begins. He drives his rental car past the old dive bars they used to frequent. He walks into his parents' house, which is saturated with decades of complex emotional history and subtle stressors.
He is already experiencing ego depletion just from navigating the travel and the family dynamics.
Then Saturday night comes. He goes to a restaurant to meet his old friends. They are already a few rounds in. The table is covered in empty glasses. The smell is in the air. The laughter is loud.
And immediately, they offer him a drink, expecting him to be the old David.
The social baseline pressure is instantly activated. His friends' expectations threaten him with subtle social ostracization if he refuses to participate in the ritual.
But more intensely, the environmental cues are bombarding his amygdala and hippocampus. And this is where a critical psychological mechanism takes over. It's known in the research as the elaborated intrusion theory of desire, or EI theory.
I found the EI theory fascinating in the sources. What exactly is happening in David's working memory at this moment at the table?
EI theory, developed by researchers like David Kavanaugh, explains how cravings actually hijack human consciousness.
Hijack it how?
When David is thrust into this deeply depriving situation surrounded by cues, his basal ganglia doesn't just send a vague signal of, "I want a drink." It violently seizes his working memory.
Like taking control of the screen.
It begins to spontaneously generate highly vivid, multisensory mental imagery of the old habit.
It's like his brain boots up a high-definition movie projector inside his mind, and he cannot look away.
Precisely. His brain simulates the exact physical sensation of the glass in his hand. He vividly imagines the cold temperature of the liquid. He anticipates the exact moment of chemical relief that follows the first sip.
So it's not just a thought, it's a full-body simulation.
Yes. This imagery hijacks what psychologists call the visuospatial sketchpad and the phonological loop. Those are the components of the brain responsible for holding information in real time.
So his cognitive bandwidth is completely maxed out.
It is monopolized. These intrusive images are highly pleasurable to imagine, but paradoxically, they simultaneously create an agonizing awareness of the deficit.
Because he knows he doesn't have it.
Right. David becomes overwhelmingly, painfully aware of what he's missing. He can't even focus on the conversation his friends are having. He is nodding along, but his internal reality is consumed by the craving.
So let's look at David's state in this exact moment. He is cognitively exhausted from the travel and the family stress. His ego depletion is high.
Very high.
The physical environment is relentlessly firing off cues. The basal ganglia has flooded his system with dopamine, creating a massive motivational drive. The elaborated intrusion imagery has blinded his working memory.
And the evolutionary fear of social rejection is pressing on his shoulders.
The beach ball is under immense surging pressure.
It is a perfect, catastrophic storm of biological and psychological forces. His prefrontal cortex is completely outmatched.
And finally, David breaks. He reaches out, takes the glass, and takes a drink. The beach ball violently erupts to the surface.
And the neurological cascade in that fraction of a second is profound. The moment the alcohol hits his system, The dopamine circuit
The
completes.
cravings stop.
He experiences a fleeting microsecond of immense physiological relief. The craving stops. But that relief is immediately followed by the crushing, suffocating weight of cognitive dissonance.
The shame hits him like a physical blow to the stomach. He realizes, I made it 3 weeks. I suffered through the withdrawals. I swore to myself I was done. And I threw it all away in a single moment of weakness.
The internal friction between his identity as someone trying to recover and his action of drinking is excruciating.
He cannot stand feeling like a pathetic failure in front of his friends, but more devastatingly in front of himself.
The psychological pain of that dissonance is literally unbearable. His brain has to deploy emergency measures to stop the pain. So how does David soothe himself while sitting at that table? He resorts to act rationalization.
Right. He doesn't sit there and analytically say, I experienced an overwhelming convergence of environmental triggers and working memory hijacking while in a state of ego depletion.
No one does that in the moment.
He says, I'm just fundamentally flawed. I don't have the discipline other people have. My dad was a drinker, so I'm genetically doomed to be this way. Trying to quit was a stupid, arrogant idea anyway.
He convinces himself that the healthy goal was never meant for him. He dismantles his own hope to numb the pain of the failure.
And so he abandons the goal entirely. He spends the rest of the weekend binge drinking even heavier than before because the dam has broken.
It's a deeply heartbreaking narrative. Because David isn't a weak person. He isn't lacking character. He simply relied on a fragile, flawed strategy, pure willpower, in a situation that demanded a robust, systemic understanding of his own neurobiology.
It is heartbreaking, and it is the exact cycle millions of people live in every single day. So the ultimate question becomes, how do we break this?
Yeah, how do we get out?
If we are David, sitting in the aftermath of a failure, drowning in shame and cognitive dissonance, how do we stop the rationalization process? How do we stop the self-destruction and actually move forward?
To shatter that cycle, we have to execute a complete radical shift in how we relate to our own internal experiences. We have to stop fighting the water.
Stop fighting the water.
This is where the clinical work of psychologists like Dr. Jason Lillis, who's heavily involved in acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, becomes our primary tool. Lillis introduces a concept that feels entirely backwards at first glance, the paradox of acceptance.
The paradox of acceptance.
Yes. When we hear the word acceptance, our cultural conditioning tells us that it means resignation.
It sounds like giving up. Like throwing in the towel and letting the bad habit win.
But in the context of behavioral psychology, acceptance is the absolute necessary catalyst for change. The paradox is this. To successfully change your outward behavior, you must first completely and unconditionally accept your current internal thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations without an ounce of judgment.
Wait, let me unpack this because this directly challenges my instincts.
Also,
When I am hit with a massive craving for sugar or I feel a wave of anxiety about failing a project, my immediate instinct is combat. My prefrontal cortex yells, stop feeling this way. You shouldn't be craving this. Push the feeling down.
and that combat is precisely what fuels the cycle. In ACT, this is known as experiential avoidance.
Experiential avoidance.
When you judge your own internal experience, when you declare a craving or an emotion as bad or dangerous and try to suppress it, you are actively creating more psychological distress. You are adding a heavy layer of secondary suffering on top of the initial craving.
You turn a natural biological response into a moral crisis.
Exactly.
That reminds me of the physics of quicksand. Fighting your own feelings is exactly like falling into a pit of quicksand.
I love that analogy. Walk me through that.
Well, if you unexpectedly step into quicksand, your primitive amygdala response is absolute panic. It tells you to thrash around, to kick your legs, to try and rip yourself out by sheer frantic force.
This is pure fight or flight.
Right. But the physical properties of quicksand dictate that the more violently you struggle, the more you agitate the sand and the faster you sink. Your own desperate struggle is the exact mechanism that pulls you under.
So fighting it kills you.
Yeah. The only way to survive quicksand is completely counterintuitive. You have to stop fighting. You have to force your body to lay back, spread your weight out, and accept the terrifying feeling of the sand enveloping you. You have to find a point of stillness within the panic.
That's powerful.
Saying, I unconditionally accept my current feelings is like laying back in the quicksand. It doesn't mean you want to be in the quicksand. It doesn't mean you plan to live there forever. But accepting the reality of the sand is the only way to stop drowning, so you can calmly figure out how to slowly extract yourself.
That is a stunningly accurate metaphor.
Yeah.
Acceptance is laying back.
Yeah.
It is observing your internal state and saying, It is okay that I'm having this thought. It is okay that my basal ganglia is currently flooding my system with a craving.
Just acknowledging it.
Right. You realize these sensations are just echoes of my past behavior and my current environment. They are data. They do not mean I am morally broken, and most importantly, they do not dictate my next physical action.
You essentially decouple the feeling from the behavior.
Exactly. This process is called cognitive diffusion. You diffuse the bomb. When you stop violently fighting the craving, it loses its psychological leverage over you. You make physical and emotional room for it.
You let it exist.
You let it exist in the passenger seat of the car, but you refuse to let it grab the steering wheel. As Lillis points out, you start by looking inside and saying, I accept this feeling. And doing so frees up the immense cognitive energy you are wasting on suppression.
And then you can use that energy for something else.
You can then use that freed up energy to look at your behavior and say, I choose to act differently.
This concept of acceptance connects so perfectly to another massive pillar of the research we need to discuss. Because truly accepting your feelings without judgment requires a very specific cognitive architecture.
It does.
It requires what the legendary psychologist Carol Dweck identified as a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset.
Dweck's work is foundational here, because a fixed mindset is essentially the ultimate manifestation of the act rationalization we discussed earlier.
It really is. A fixed mindset operates on the core assumption that your intelligence, your personality, your talents, and crucially, your capacity for self-control are innate and static. You are just born this way. The concrete is poured.
And if you attempt to change a habit and you fail, a fixed mindset interprets that failure as definitive proof of your permanent limitations.
It's a highly convenient narrative because if you are permanently flawed, you are absolved of the responsibility to keep trying.
It creates a protective shell around the ego. I'm just not a morning person. I just have an addictive personality. I'm just not good with money. These aren't just casual phrases. They are fixed identity statements that paralyze neuroplasticity.
Right. But a growth mindset views those exact same traits. Focus, discipline, emotional regulation. Not as fixed traits, but as muscles.
Muscles that atrophy with neglect but can be systematically developed through effort, strategy, and learning. A growth mindset intuitively understands the reality of neuroplasticity.
And what absolutely blew my mind in the source material is that these two mindsets aren't just abstract philosophical concepts. They actually look different on a physical level under a brain scanner, don't they?
They do. The neuroimaging data here is profound. When researchers put people in fMRI machines or hook them up to EEGs to monitor electrical activity, they can literally see the mindset in action.
How does that work?
When people who operate with a growth mindset face a setback or make an error, there is increased sustained activation in two critical brain regions, the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC.
Okay, let's put into the mechanics. What exactly are those two areas doing when we fail?
The ACC acts as your brain's sophisticated conflict monitor. When you make a mistake, say you meant to type one word but typed another, or you meant to skip dessert but ate it anyway, the ACC detects the discrepancy between your intention and your action.
So it knows you messed up.
It generates an electrical signal called the error-related negativity, or EARN. It's an alarm bell that says, hey, we made a mistake here.
And the DLPFC?
The DLPFC is the steering wheel. It is heavily involved in working memory, cognitive flexibility, and implementing control. When the ACC sounds the alarm, the DLPFC kicks in to analyze the error, adjust the strategy, and alter the behavior for the next attempt.
So they work together.
In a growth mindset, when a person fails, these areas light up brilliantly. The brain is aggressively analyzing the failure to extract data. The person processes the failure not as a devastating threat to their core identity, but as a valuable piece of the learning puzzle.
Setbacks are data, not character flaws.
Exactly. But contrast that with a fixed mindset. In a fixed mindset, when a person makes an error, the EARN signal in the ACC is significantly blunted.
Really? It just ignores it.
The brain literally pays less attention to the mistake. Instead, their brain activity spikes only when they receive feedback about the final result, or the judgment, like looking at a grade on a test or hearing someone criticize them. They're entirely focused on the threat to their ego rather than the mechanics of learning.
So with a growth mindset, you aren't trying to force change through sheer willpower. You are literally physically growing your brain into the change. You are utilizing your ACC and DLPFC to treat every relapse, every moment of weakness as a stepping stone to refine your strategy.
You are engaging with the neuroplastic process consciously. And that brings us to the bridge between theory and reality.
Right. If we accept our feelings to stop the quicksand and we adopt a growth mindset to utilize our brain's error monitoring systems, how do we actually walk out into our kitchens and our living rooms and build these new neural pathways?
You have to get practical.
What are the practical, gentle steps for lasting change that bypass the basal ganglia? Because we have thoroughly established that brute force willpower is a losing game. The research points to a completely different starting line. True, sustainable change cannot start with the outcome. It has to start with identity.
This is a vital pivot. Think about how almost everyone sets goals on New Year's Eve. They set outcome-based goals. I want to lose 20 pounds. I want to run a marathon. I want to stop drinking.
The problem with outcome goals is that they exist in a distant theoretical future. They feel entirely disconnected from the person you are right now, sitting on the couch.
And they rely entirely on the emotion of motivation to pull you toward them.
And as we know, motivation is a fleeting emotion.
The superior alternative, backed by behavioral science, is to shift entirely to identity-based goals. Instead of asking the question, what do I want to achieve, you ask a much deeper question. Who is the type of person I wish to become?
You shift the language. I am the type of person who values my physical health. I'm a writer. I'm someone who processes stress without relying on alcohol.
Exactly. This leverages cognitive dissonance in your favor. Remember, humans have a deep psychological need to act in alignment with their perceived identity to avoid the pain of dissonance.
Oh, that's clever. Use the dissonance for good.
Right. If you genuinely start to internalize the belief that you are a runner, then putting on your running shoes at 6 a.m. isn't an exhausting chore requiring willpower. It is simply a reaffirmation of your identity. The behavior naturally matches the self-image, significantly reducing the cognitive friction.
Okay, so I've laid back in the quicksand of acceptance. I've adopted a growth mindset. I've defined the identity I want to embody. Now I actually have to execute the behavior in the physical world.
The hard part.
And this is the exact moment where ambitious people usually bite off way more than they can chew, right?
It is the most common point of failure. We turn to the research of Dr. Paul McCarthy here, which emphasizes a crucial philosophy. You must build systems rather than relying on motivation. And the first non-negotiable rule of building a behavioral system is to start smaller than you think is necessary.
We are talking ridiculously, almost comically small. It's so small that it bypasses the need for the prefrontal cortex almost entirely. If you rely on a massive wave of motivation to execute a grueling hour-long workout, you might do it for 3 days. But you will inevitably fail on the 4th day when the motivation wave doesn't arrive.
So instead of committing to an hour at the gym, your goal is to do exactly 5 push-ups before you get in the shower. Or instead of committing to meditating for 30 minutes, you commit to sitting in silence for 60 seconds.
Yes. By radically shrinking the scope of the behavior, you remove the psychological resistance. You are effectively slipping past the basal ganglia's defense mechanisms because the energy cost is so low, it doesn't register as a threat.
It's too small to fight.
Exactly. But here is the secret. Once you do those 5 push-ups consistently, every single morning for a month, neuroplasticity does its job. The neural pathway is physically established, the habit becomes automated.
And from that solid foundation, expanding the behavior from 5 push-ups to 10 or to a full 20-minute workout is exponentially easier because the neurological infrastructure is already built. You aren't just doing 5 push-ups. You are casting tiny, undeniable votes for your new identity. You are providing your brain with evidence that you are the type of person who works out.
But to ensure those tiny votes actually happen, we can't just leave it to chance. We need to intentionally manipulate the triggers we discussed earlier. We need to utilize a strategy the research calls habit stacking.
Habit stacking is a highly practical application of what psychologist Peter Gollwitzer calls implementation intentions. It is a way to manually program your brain with an if-then algorithmic scenario.
Sort of like coding your brain.
Very much like that. The formula is elegantly simple. After my current habit, I will execute my new habit.
You essentially piggyback the new fragile behavior onto a strong, deeply automated behavior that already exists in your basal ganglia.
Exactly. You already possess dozens of deeply ingrained fail-proof habits. Brushing your teeth, pouring your first cup of coffee, taking off your shoes when you get home, turning off your alarm. You use these existing concrete routines as a specific environmental cue for your new habit.
So it looks like this. After I pour my morning coffee, I will immediately open my journal and write 1 sentence. Or, after I take off my work shoes, I will immediately put on my running shoes.
Right. The pouring of the coffee and the removing of the shoes become the tripwires. You don't have to decide to journal. The coffee decides for you. It bypasses the need for executive decision-making.
And this strategy absolutely must be coupled with rigorous environment design. We established earlier that your environment is vastly more powerful than your conscious intentions.
So much more powerful.
If you are serious about changing, you must ruthlessly curate your physical spaces so that the positive choices are the absolute easiest, most frictionless options available, and the negative choices are heavily obstructed.
This is about managing cognitive load. If you want to eat healthier, you cannot rely on willpower to resist the junk food sitting in your pantry every time you walk into the kitchen. Your prefrontal cortex will eventually lose that battle.
You have to throw the junk food in the trash and put a bowl of fresh, washed fruit directly in the center of the kitchen counter.
Or if you want to stop mindlessly watching TV after work, you take the batteries out of the remote control and put them in a drawer in the guest bedroom.
You are intentionally adding physical friction to the bad habit and completely removing friction from the good habit. You are making the water flow in the direction you want to swim.
But of course, we have to be realistic. Even with meticulous environment design and habit stacking, cravings will still arise. The elaborated intrusion imagery will still occasionally flare up.
Yeah, we're human.
And when it does, the psychological sources suggest a brilliant cognitive tool known as shifting from low-level control to high-level control.
Control level theory, developed by Yakov Troka and Nero Lieberman. This is essentially a mental gear shift to change how you perceive a temptation.
It is. Low-level control involves thinking about actions, objects, or events in highly concrete, detailed, and immediate terms. It focuses heavily on sensory details and the mechanics of how to do something.
So, if I'm staring at a piece of chocolate cake at a party, low-level control is focusing on how rich and glossy the chocolate frosting looks. It's imagining the dense texture of the cake. It's anticipating the immediate, intense burst of sugar on my tongue.
Yes, and operating in low-level control massively amplifies the emotional pull of the temptation. It feeds the craving. High-level control, on the other hand, involves thinking abstractly.
Stepping back.
It forces you to step back and focus on the broader meaning, the core values, and the long-term outcomes. It shifts the question from how or what to why.
So shifting to high-level control means deliberately tearing my focus away from the frosting and asking myself, why am I trying to be healthy in the first place? Because I want to have the sustained physical energy to play with my children without getting winded. Because I am a person who respects the longevity of my body.
Exactly. Research demonstrates that simply forcing your brain to adopt a high-level control, focusing on the abstract why, significantly reduces the immediate visceral pull of temptations. It engages the prefrontal cortex to override the basal ganglia's demand for immediate gratification. It reconnects you to your identity in the moment of weakness.
That is a powerful tool to have in your back pocket.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of other highly effective strategies mentioned in the research that act as guardrails. One of them is temptation bundling.
Temptation bundling, popularized by researcher Catherine Milkman, is a brilliant way to leverage your existing desires. It involves pairing a want, something that provides immediate gratification, with a need, the habit you are trying to build that has delayed rewards.
You essentially bribe your basal ganglia. For example, you make a rule that you are only allowed to listen to your absolute favorite, highly addictive true crime podcast while you are physically at the gym.
That's a classic example.
Or you are only allowed to watch your favorite reality TV show while you are folding the laundry or doing the dishes. You use the immediate dopamine hit of the podcast to pull you through the friction of the workout.
You link the two activities so tightly that the anticipation of the podcast actually triggers the motivation to go to the gym.
And finally, to eliminate the sheer exhaustion of constant decision-making, there is the strategy of establishing bright line rules.
Bright line rules. These are absolute, unequivocal boundaries. There is no gray area.
None at all.
Precisely. Most people set vague intentions, like, I'm going to try to drink less this month, or I'm going to eat better. The fatal flaw of a vague intention is that it requires you to make a fresh decision every single time you are faced with a choice.
Which leads straight back to ego depletion. You wear out your prefrontal cortex negotiating with yourself. You stand in the kitchen and think, does this one glass of wine count? Is it okay because it's a Friday? I had a hard day. Maybe I deserve it. The negotiation itself drains your willpower.
Exactly. A bright line rule entirely eliminates the internal negotiation. I do not drink alcohol on weekdays. I do not eat processed sugar. I do not look at my phone after 9 p.m. It is a clear, unambiguous line drawn in the sand.
It's pre-decided.
By making the decision once ahead of time, you completely remove the decision fatigue. And more importantly, it shifts the behavior from feeling like a painful sacrifice to a firm statement of identity. When offered a drink on a Tuesday, you don't say, "I can't have that." You say, "I am simply not a person who drinks on weekdays."
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've traveled from the historical paradigm shifts of neuroplasticity down into the microscopic dopamine pathways of the basal ganglia, through the agonizing psychological pain of cognitive dissonance, and finally into the practical systems-based tools for designing a new life.
It's been quite a journey.
And as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to take a moment to synthesize all of this. I want to cut through the clinical terminology and speak directly to you, the listener, right where you are.
Yeah, this is the core message.
If you take absolutely nothing else away from the last hour of this discussion, please hear and internalize this. You are not broken.
You are not broken.
When you struggle to change, when you inevitably fall back into old, destructive patterns despite your best intentions, it is not because you lack moral fortitude. It is not because you are weak or fundamentally flawed.
It's just biology.
It is because you possess a highly evolved, magnificently complex human brain that is exquisitely designed to automate behavior for efficiency, to seek immediate relief from psychological pain, and to prioritize social belonging above almost all else. You have been trying to fight a raging biological tide with nothing but the fragile, easily exhausted paddle of willpower.
But you absolutely can change. The overwhelming scientific consensus of neuroplasticity proves that your brain is not poured in concrete. It is built for continuous, lifelong evolution.
You just need a more compassionate, intelligent approach. An approach that works with your basal ganglia and your environment rather than declaring war on them.
It starts by laying back in the quicksand. It starts with acceptance, allowing yourself to feel the messy, uncomfortable, intensely frustrating reality of being human without aggressively judging yourself for it.
It requires treating your failures not as indictments of your character, but as valuable data points through a growth mindset. It requires meticulously designing your physical environment, starting with habits so ridiculously small they feel trivial, and tying your daily actions deeply to the identity of the person you truly, authentically want to become.
And as you embark on that journey, as you wake up tomorrow and try again, I want to leave you with one final, quiet realization to carry with you.
What's that?
When you implement these systems, every single time you perform one of those tiny, seemingly insignificant positive actions, every time you do those 5 push-ups before the shower, every time you pause and take one deep breath instead of reacting in anger, every time you shift into high-level construal to remember your why, you're not just checking a box on an arbitrary to-do list.
You are physically altering the microscopic anatomy of your own mind.
With every small, consistent repetition, you are actively laying down myelin. You are generating new neural pathways. You are structurally rewiring the incredible machine inside your skull. You are literally, on a cellular level, becoming a new person. Change is not a sudden magical event that happens to you. It is a structure you are slowly, deliberately, and beautifully building inside yourself.
So take a deep breath. Show yourself some profound grace for the times you've struggled in the past. The water was strong, but now you know how to build a boat. You don't have to change everything all at once. In fact, you shouldn't. Just start incredibly small today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.